Hello, I'm your host, Warren Shaw. I'm a white man, age 60s, with a shaved head and glasses. I'm an historian of the disability rights movement in New York City and the son of Julie and Molly Shaw, two of the movement's founders. Allow me to refer you to my history column in Able News, to my website, disabilityhistorynyc.com, and to my history channel, Disability History NYC. We're here today as part of the Disability Unite Festival 2026. This year's theme is a more accessible union, and in keeping with that theme, Disability Unite has asked that we explore ideas surrounding disability as a part of our identity as people with disabilities. More specifically, we're going to examine questions like, how can we use education to get broader recognition for our community and our place in society? What can we do outside of schools to encourage broader disability education efforts within schools? And how does our changing place in U.S. society inform our community's identity? These questions interact with each other. They go to a sort of feedback loop in which education helps shape the culture and the culture helps shape education, with a view towards enhancing, advancing the disability rights movement. The topic invites us to think about long-term structures and long-term strategies. To be blunt, how do we move to the next phase of the disability revolution? The disability revolution isn't a phrase I hear a lot, but I hope we never lose sight of the revolutionary nature of our movement. How do we get to where disability doesn't matter? To where universal access is pretty much everywhere, where disability is just a fact to be dealt with and no longer means struggling with dismissive attitudes and fighting against a stymied life? Where using a wheelchair, say, isn't much different from wearing eyeglasses in order to achieve a more accessible union here in the United States. That's our topic today. This film is about the present and the future. To evaluate where we are in the present, to measure the changes already achieved, which we probably barely notice anymore in a lot of cases, we need a return to where we were before the disability rights movement began. It's hard to imagine the difficulty and isolation that most people with disabilities faced before our movement. Any sort of travel, even getting out the front door, was difficult or worse because of barriers in the built environment and unusable public transit. Work was hard to find because even if you could get to a job, you couldn't get a job. Most employers wouldn't hire anyone with a disability, period, and they weren't shy about saying so. If you wanted the company of your peers or wanted to become politically active, you were pretty much out of luck there too. Community life and political access ranged from slim to none. To give you an example of the way it used to be, back in 1951, before our movement began, a man who'd had a leg amputated went to one of the then existing disability organizations for help because he'd been turned down for a job as a drill press operator, even though he'd had experience in that line of work after his amputation. This fellow had a master's degree in English literature from Columbia and was a former professional trumpet player, really a remarkably accomplished individual, seeking a relatively low-level livelihood, but all that organization could do for him was to give him a lead on some no doubt even lower-level job if he learned how to type. And as inadequate as that response seems, back in 1951, the organization in question was so proud of this case that they reported it to the New York Times, and the Times ran the story. It took 100 years for the pushback against this legacy to reach critical mass. In the modern era, it began with the paralyzed veterans of World War II, then moved into the civilian realm with people like Julie and Molly Shaw, Curtis Brewer, and Richard Match. Starting around 1970, the baby boomers took up the crusade. People like Judy Heumann enormously expanded the movement, notched a huge list of accomplishments, and created an array of institutions which continue to shape the movement to this day. But where are we today? Measured against the nearly infinite dimensions of our complicated and forever changing society, where are we? After more than 60 years of the modern disability rights movement, where are we going, and how will we know when we get there? That's the terrain we're trying to get into in this film. Our subject matter territory ranges from education to culture and back again. Culture, of course, takes in the disability community itself, the general society, popular culture, scholarly and fine arts culture, politics, and plenty more. I wanted to speak with people who can cover a lot of these bases. And to start us off in particular, I needed an educator with a broad perspective on both the academic world and the cultural environment that we all live in. Now, let's go to our guests. I'm very pleased indeed to introduce Chris Rosa. Chris is the president and CEO of the Viscardi Center, a network of nonprofits that educate, employ, and empower children and adults with disabilities. Viscardi houses K through 12 schooling, publishes Able News, and runs the Museum of Disability History. Before coming to Viscardi, Chris was for many years the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Inclusion Initiatives at the City University of New York, the nation's largest urban public university system. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Warren. So thrilled to be here.
So, to start us off, where are we in the arc of the disability revolution?
It's a very interesting question. In many respects, when you consider the full arc of American history, our progress has certainly been undeniable in objective terms, in terms of acceptance and inclusion of people with disabilities. But yet, when you think about it in revolutionary terms, where the balance of power has shifted in a significant way so that people with disabilities are full and equal partners in the American dream, we still have miles to travel. And hopefully it will not take decades to traverse, but we certainly still have a long way to go.
What is the state of disability history as a subject in our educational system, both higher ed and K to 12? And how has that state changed over the course of your career?
Sure. Well, in terms of disability education, disability studies, I'm proud to say, continues to be a burgeoning academic discipline in higher education. There are more than 400 disability studies programs in higher ed institutions in the United States. And when it comes to uh, catalogs that validate disability studies as a distinct academic discipline. We're well represented. Their enrollment is high. And in terms of meaningful inclusion in the post-secondary experience, while it's important for students with disabilities to have equal access to all dimensions of campus life, the gold standard is whether or not your experiences, your lived experiences, are represented among the faculty and within the curricula that you're studying. And the fact that disability studies is so readily available now is extraordinarily validating and an affirmation of the growth of disability studies and disability history in higher ed. In K through 12, we're not there yet. And it's a little disheartening to know that individuals with disabilities actually have to get to college to get to the place where they can study the experiences and the history of people with disabilities as a valid course of academic study and inquiry. At the Viscardi Center, through the Museum of Disability History and through our Kornreich Institute for Disability Studies, we're proud to claim that we're actively engaged in weaving disability history into all aspects of our K through 12 curricula. But those programs are very scarce in the K through 12 setting. Through our Museum of Disability History, we're also pleased to be the host for Emerging America, which is a repository of disability history and disability studies curricula in K through 12 on behalf of the Library of Congress. So there is a vast repository of curricular resources and instructional materials for anybody who's looking to teach disability history and disability culture in K through 12. It's just the coalition of the willing is small at this point, and we're working together with other schools to try to grow that commitment to disability history in K through 12.
Disability studies, I think those courses tend to attract enrollment by students with disabilities. Now, including disabilities as a subject of study can be mandated, I believe. Can you talk about those efforts?
Sure, good. It's a good point, Warren. Um, our neighbors across the river in New Jersey have already required it as part of the curricula in K through 12. Sort of the standard bearers for that effort are states like Massachusetts, who are way out ahead of it and is the home of the Emerging America curriculum, where they've taken it upon themselves to collect all such instructional materials in the K through 12 setting, um, and curated on behalf of the Library of Congress. Um, Here in New York, uh, the only avenue, organic avenue for disability history and disability culture instruction to occur and be validated is through the New York State's mandate for culturally responsive curricula. And that includes what we used to refer to without fear as DEI curricula. And disability gets a mention there, although it's not prominently featured in any of the examples of what would constitute K through 12 curricula. Here at the Henry Viscardi School, and in particular, and our Kornreich Institute for Disability Studies in general, we're emboldening schools in New York State to lean into that standard and to claim disability identity as one that is integral to the concept of DEI, and urge schools to lean into that in order to create an opportunity to weave disability studies into traditional curricula in ways that are validated and give them credit, check the box around meeting the standard around culturally responsive education.
Now, on a more non-mandatory voluntary level, let's talk about ways that we can raise the profile of disability history as a general interest subject in the education system. And to start us off on that question, let me tell you a little story. When my mother was a public school, grade school student in New York City in the 1930s, there was a guest appearance in her class by Helen Keller. And my mom told me about that day several times during my childhood because Helen Keller was such a dazzling figure. Not just because she was multiply disabled, but because of what she did with her life.
Right.
She was a suffragist, she was a Christian socialist, she was a co-founder of the ACLU. And within a few years after this encounter, my mother became politically active. Within a few years after that, when she developed epilepsy, she got involved with the very first self-help effort for people with epilepsy. And some years after that, after my mother married my father, a man who used crutches and a wheelchair, they became two of the most important and earliest founders of the movement in our city. So let's never doubt the importance of those grade school encounters. We
Now,
just have to make sure that they happen.
here,
And
here.
and I'll tell you one other story. When I was a public school grade schooler in the New York City system in the 1960s, that back then the city's public schools still had segregated classes for kids with disabilities. One day when I was in second grade, I happened to get a peek into one of those classrooms through an open door. And even though My brilliant and charismatic father used crutches and a wheelchair, and I saw him every day. Those kids scared me. And looking back at it, it's absurd. And yet it underscores the evils of segregation. Simply by othering ourselves from each other, it does harm.
It's a great example, Warren, of how the way in which disability is constructed socially by setting um, can have either a tremendously chilling effect or empowering effect on even the people who are intimate with the disability experience. I mean, you had great intimacy, obviously, with the best possible empowering role models when it came to living and thriving with a disability in your parents. And yet, people with similar characteristics in a separate, segregated setting is terrifying, can be terrifying, um, largely because you know the way that life can be lived so richly and inclusively, and the notion that that could be stolen from you simply by the setting in which you find yourself, that in of itself, I think, could be a terrifying level, even if it's at a subconscious, visceral reaction to being confronted with that image.
So, to raise the profile of disability and disability history in the K to 12 sphere, we need to get out there. We need to be seen. We need to be heard. But in my work as a historian, I find that our story, the disability rights, the disability history story, isn't very well known even within our community. And if we don't know our stories, and on one hand, I don't know why our community should be any more history oriented than any other American community, but if we don't know our stories, how can we expect other people to learn them or know them or be interested in them? And how are we going to move the disability revolution forward without that?
Uh, I mean, I think you make a really important observation. When you look at the arc of any social movement, they're all anchored in very powerful origin stories. It's a really important not only to getting history right and owning it, but in terms of identity formation, um, we all can point to it as the beginning of who we are and how we experience our disability in a way that's qualitatively different than the limiting and often stigmatizing way in which we're constructed by contemporary American culture. It gives us this very firm foundation to construct our experiences and our identity in in an alternate, very empowering way. And I think the important way to start that is through oral histories, where even though we have a rich history as a movement, we're still a comparatively young movement in terms of its origins, and we're so blessed to have the founding brothers and sisters of that movement very often still with us. And so the opportunity to hear it in their own resonant, authentic voices, in their own terms, is very powerful. And so we're working urgently at the Museum of Disability History to capture those through an oral history project by incorporating multimedia in our exhibits. So you get to hear directly from the founders themselves and through our kids program, the Kornreich Institute for Disability Studies. We link the museum to the curriculum to bringing in speakers, as you suggested, so that we use the museum surrounded by disability history as this very unique setting for these originators of our movement to tell their stories, hoping that we create these indelible memories like the kind that you just shared for, for your mom and for you.
Your comment about oral history raises a unique wrinkle for our community, which is the legacy of not just segregation, but isolation from each other has interfered with our collective memory, oral history, and knowledge of legends. That's why the oral history that you're collecting and I'm collecting and others is so very important because otherwise it's just lost.
You, you're correct. And if I could just an observation about segregation and the double-edged sword there. Undoubtedly, the isolation that people with disabilities still experience through segregation prevents us very often from sharing the oral history. On the other hand, any revolution, conflict theorists will tell you that by segregating people, you sow the seeds for revolution, because that's where consciousness is built. People with disabilities forced to get together um, by circumstances not of their own making, reappropriate those terms and share their stories, build consciousness, uh, build an empowered identities, and sow the seeds of revolution. On some level, I mean, we all love Crip Camp for so many reasons. What a glorious documentary! And those are our founders, the founders of our movement. And it was all created by, even though we don't think of it as a segregated camp, it was camp where only attended by people with disabilities, which on the one hand is segregation. On the other hand, what a glorious occasion for these teenagers uh, to create new empowered identities for themselves on their own terms simply by sharing and lifting each other up.
For people who aren't familiar, Crip Camp is a 2020 documentary uh, produced by Barack and Michelle Obama about the history of Camp Jened in upstate New York, which was turned out to be an extremely fertile ground for disability leadership in the 70s. But there have been camps for kids with disabilities since the very early 20th century. And it's interesting, though, that Camp Jened turned out to be so singular. That is something that I have wondered about. I'm not sure I'll ever get to the bottom of it. Perhaps it was timing, a critical mass of personalities. Uh,
I,
I'm not
I
sure.
I've wondered the same thing. I think I've always imagined that it was a combination of both. That you, on the one hand, the political firmament in which everybody was immersed with the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, all bubbling up all around everyone. It was hard for all people, let alone young people, not to be inspired by that and to understand their own experiences in the same term. But you can't discount leadership and the uniqueness of the individuals who were there. I mean, you couldn't create another Judy Human if you tried, and in a lab, she's the quintessential civil rights hero and heroine of our times.
Yeah, yeah. So turning now to matters outside the educational system, you have a lot of years in the disability rights movement, so let me ask you, how has the general level of public acceptance and awareness of disability, the visibility of disability, if I can borrow Alice Wong's phrase, how has that changed over your career?
I think that it's certainly been slow to change, but I think that um, the visibility of disability is more prominent in 2026 than it has been over the arc of my life. and my observations about looking for traces of people like us in popular culture, in leadership. Again, I think we have a long way to go. If you look at the LGBTQI movement for rights and opportunities for member of the queer community, they're sort of the standard bearer, I think, in terms of really taking hold of popular culture and demanding representation in media, in advertising, in politics against tremendous backlash. I think that we're seeing more and more of it. I think that a truly inclusive ad campaign realizes that they've missed the market if they don't include a wheelchair user or somebody who is blind or somebody who is deaf. We see now in streaming series more and more about neurodivergent individuals. Love and Autism is I think has cultural capital beyond our community. And yet we have so far to go. I'm so excited about the political candidacy of Josh Turek in Iowa, and the notion that we might add another member of Congress with a disability to the handful of leaders who own that identity. On the one hand, it would be historic. On the other hand, what the heck are we waiting for? With 20% of Americans having a disability and yet a small fraction of Congress, the people who represent us, having that. I think that's a sign that you've really arrived as a political constituency when you have that kind of representation. So we still have a long way to go.
There have always been people with disabilities in our society, and there have always been people with disabilities in visible roles, but a lot of the time they were passing, so to speak. I'm thinking of political figures like Bob Dole or even Eugene Nickerson, who was county executive of Nassau County and later a federal court judge and a polio survivor, or famous figures like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, who had very serious bouts with polio when they were children. The fact that they are passing is understandable in their time and so forth, but when the day comes that that is no longer necessary, that's when we'll have gotten somewhere in terms of getting our stories out. And at its root, history is three things. It's good stories that are well told, that make a difference to their listeners. And we have great stories. We
You do.
need to get out there and tell them.
And
And
I know
with
you, oh, sorry, please,
That's
that
okay.
the ultimate standard for um, uh, passing as someone other than having a disability, of course, is FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the leader of the free world, who was a wheelchair user with polio. And yet, in the great book, FDR's Splendid Deception, um, it speaks about how uh, his cabinet, his family, Congress, and the media itself conspired to construct him as someone without a disability, to protect us all from the notion that the leader of the free world could, in fact, be a person with a disability.
And, speaking of the importance of being in the right place at the right time, that deception could never happen today.
No, not at
Uh,
all.
a-
You're
and
100% right.
and we would have been far worse off without FDR, all of us.
Sure. I mean, and
So,
look what the potential risk. We'll see how that all plays out. But Gavin Newsom's disclosure that he had a learning disability, and making it making him ripe for attack by our current president. And by it's been interesting to watch the public discourse around this, and just how many people call into question somebody's viability to lead the great state of California and potentially to be a candidate for the presidency simply because they have a learning disability and own it, is sobering.
Yes. Uh, so, as we've been discussing, not too many decades ago, we were almost completely segregated, isolated from each other, and invisible. We're less segregated and more visible today, but the legacy of segregation is still with us in the recent attacks on Section 504 and other hard-won gains, which I guess aren't as bulletproof as we thought they were, in our own continuing inward focus as a community, and in our employment and poverty statistics. I think the next phase of the disability revolution has to involve us getting out into the general society and drawing people in so we can tell our stories. What are your thoughts on changing our community's inward focus, which, as a historical artifact is completely understandable, but nonetheless it keeps people out. And my favorite example is the Disability Pride Parade so far has been a very small affair. Uh, and it would be great if we could get more of an audience and maybe even some corporate sponsorship. Uh, Unlike the Gay Pride Parade, which some people say suffers from an excess of corporate sponsorship, that is not our problem.
It is not yet.
So, what are your thoughts on changing our community's inward focus?
Uh, I'll give you two observations. One is based more on our lived experiences as people with disability who have been fortunate enough to grow up um, in the disability rights movement. Um, we've seen the transformative power and the feedback loop that you described earlier about the power of education uh, that can occur in schools, which lead to a different public discourse surrounding the way that we understand people with disabilities and their role in our communities, living inclusively in communities, and how that, again, enriches the feedback to education. And it's a virtuous circle that I think ultimately can spin us forward uh, as a community when it comes to a broader awareness, broader participation. Um, and that's our hope, certainly through the Museum of Disability History, to play a small part in that by arming people with and without disabilities a greater understanding of the arc of American disability history, and giving rise to a different way of understanding disability than we may have inherited through mainstream American culture. Um, the other is more of my my experience in training as a sociologist. I was always, when it came to revolution, I was always very taken with conflict theory as a frame of reference. And like the standard for that is Marx. But you have, I think, a more situated um, theorist when it comes to thinking about conflict theory in American democracy in C. Wright Mills, and writing about the power elite and how um, we understand our relationship, first of all, our position in society through our relationship to key strategic resources. For Marx, it was the means of production, right? Land, labor, and capital. And if you owned it, you were powerful. And if you didn't own it, you were powerless. And the only way that you could change that was to organize in order to seize greater control of the means of production. If you think of accessibility, as a key strategic resource. A theorist like C. Wright Mills would see it as one way of understanding accessibility, not just as a practical means of getting around, but as a key strategic resource. You see that it's the power elite, a small group of wealthy, influential individuals and government leaders who control the key strategic resources. And as we mentioned earlier in our conversation, you don't see a lot of people with disabilities currently represented among members of the power elite. But if we're in a position to activate our voting base, voting more people into the decision-making class with disabilities or who are intimately connected to people with disabilities, there's a greater likelihood that accessibility as a key strategic resource will start to reflect the needs and the interests of our nation's more than 60 million people with disabilities. So I know, we're if we're civically minded, we say, let's get out there and vote. It's but Justin Dart reminded us, get out there and vote like your life depends upon it, because in many respects it does. And he knew what he was talking about. He knew it meant life and death, but it also meant the quality of our lives. That until we start to get people in office who look like us, who have the same experiences like us, who have great empathy for our lived experiences with disabilities, our relationship to access as a key strategic resource will not change, and our lives will appreciably not change. So let's get out there and vote. And I'd love to put my political capital, small though it may be, behind promising candidates with disabilities.
Let's turn to pop culture as a way to make our community more visible. You can increasingly find, as you mentioned, disability-related themes and performers on stage and in theaters and on TV. I think some of the reality TV shows can get a little strained, but a lot of that material is surprisingly decent. And I have to admit, I really like the show Special. Ryan O'Connell is quite a talent. The first pop culture piece that was presented people with disabilities in a human light was the TV show Ironside, about a spinal cord injured detective who continued fighting crime after his injury. That show debuted in 1968. It was a long running hit. It was mandatory viewing in my house growing up. And now we have Jenna Bainbridge on Broadway, showing that people with visible disabilities can be on the big time stage. But on a more aspirational level, I'm thinking of the way that shows like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and Will and Grace really seem to have an effect on the broad US culture when it came to the LGBTQ community and movement. It would be really great if something like that happened with disability, and nothing has broken out quite yet. What are your thoughts on furthering things on the pop culture level?
Uh, well, I'm grateful for you to reminding me of those important seminal moments in American popular culture, that for me too framed, they were anchors of my consciousness when it came to representation of people with disabilities. Um, Media has changed so much since then, Warren, since you and I are close to the same age. And I'm reminded routinely by my students here that I think about media like an old guy, and that the beauty of and the struggle today is that media is far more diffuse. There are more than seven dial positions now when it comes to how we receive our pop culture. And the fact that individual content creators um, can be so influential through the power of social media, and that with smaller budgets or no budgets, you can create content that can get swept up in a force all its own and reach tens of millions of people, has a democratizing effect and potential when it comes to our ability to shape popular culture. The key is trying to figure out how to unleash that potential and harness that potential so that talented content creators with disabilities can advance their distinctive voices and vision. Um, I don't know how to do that because I'm not a digital native, but I marvel at people who do. And it strikes me that when we think about, okay, well, what can this emerging generation of disability rights leaders do that previous generations um, couldn't? And it may be the fact that they're digital natives and understand the medium in ways more intuitively than we do. They can create the platform that could unleash the next big things when it comes to paradigm shifting understandings of disability in contemporary culture.
How else can we move the disability revolution forward?
Um, I think that we've been we've been struggling uh, at the fact that we still only have um, roughly a third of us employed after more than 50 years of civil rights legislation designed to create equal access and opportunity for people with disabilities in the workforce is discouraging. Um, of course, we need to keep hammering away at that, but not to miss the opportunity that, uh, like the Congressional Budget Office estimates that people with disabilities and their families command up to $1 trillion in purchasing power. And for corporate entities who are always looking for the next new market, it seems that we're an untapped market right under their very noses. So our ability to generate more awareness about that and our power as consumers and leveraging that, I feel, uh, could be catalytic in transforming culture, in getting us more represented accurately and authentically in advertising, seeing us depicted in a way that is authentic in ways that resonate for the audience of 60 million people with disabilities in the United States and those who care about us uh, would be important. But leveraging that point, I feel like members of the LGBTQI community, not that's the only referent, but seeing this month is June that we're speaking in Warren and Pride Month, like all of the ad campaigns have lit up with rainbows. And, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see not only because of the pride that we all take in the representation of members of the LGBTQI community, but we see in a much more utilitarian way that corporations have taken notice that affirming those core values can make an impact at the cash register. And we have the potential to do the same thing if only recognized for our purchasing power.
So, our conversation has been aimed at long term ideas and long term strategies. And let me ask you a long term question. Where do you see the disability rights revolution 30 years from now?
Um, it's a good question. I think that we just lost an iconic figure in disability studies, Richard Scotch. And Richard uh, was a great disability social historian. And he and colleagues did an analysis for me, which was sobering in the late 90s, looking at who actually mobilized to enact the ADA, and of of whom was the disability rights movement comprised. And when you look at activists, people who are engaged, devoting, either employed or devoting a lot of time to the actual passage, advocacy and passage of disability rights laws and enforcing them, um, Richard Scotch and his colleagues pointed out the sobering truth that we're looking at thousands of people, maybe at the most, tens of thousands, like 10 to 20,000 people net nationally, that we're a strong network, but small compared to our overall numbers. And um, I'm hoping that 30 years from now, that core will continue doing what we do best, which is to organize and mobilize and expand our reach and our influence and our consciousness to, hundreds of thousands, if not a handful of millions of people with disabilities, so that we're a broadly based disability rights movement. We've always been powerful, and I think that our core has been history will show us, have been some of the finest, most influential activists that the United States has ever known. I'd like to see their work broadened so that 30 years from now, we're looking at a much more broadly based disability rights movement that is in a position to shift the culture in the ways that you and I have been musing about during our time together. So I'm hoping that's the future. And I feel like for guys like you and me in the ARC, that maybe that's our responsibility going forward. If we could leave a legacy, maybe that's an important part of it, to be able to say that we played a role in taking us from the core and expanding it to the thousands, the hundreds of thousands.
That is really a lovely wish, and a beautiful place for us to end our conversation. Thank you ever so much, Chris.
Thanks, Warren. Always learn so much from you.
And the same to you. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Speaking with Chris, I was reminded of the vastness of our movement, its breadth in time across the hugeness of our nation, the complexity of our movement, the diversity of our community. There's so much to draw upon. I came away very much heartened by speaking with Chris. We're part of a chain that stretches back further than we know and farther into the future than we can imagine. Our film deals with the intersections between education, culture, the disability community, the wider society, politics, and more. To understand where all of us as Americans are coming from, there are many, many characters with disabilities in literature, film, television, and so forth. Until fairly recently, they almost invariably portrayed disabled people as other. The traditional message has been that people with disabilities may not be entirely unhuman, but they're nonetheless sufficiently alien that audiences, of course presumed to be non-disabled, should continue their habit of avoiding them. Take, say, Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, or the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Could you ever see yourself wanting to get to know those people, or sitting down for a slice of pizza with them? Not a chance, no. You'd keep your distance from them, and by extension, from all people with disabilities. By contrast, there are more recent characters and metaphors dating from after the beginning of our movement, which present human affirmations and solidarities quite distinct from the othering message of more traditional fare. Think, for example, of the work of the Disabled in Action singers, or, more recently, writers like Alice Wong. There have always been people with disabilities in our public culture. There's Itzhak Perlman, Stevie Wonder, politicians like Max Cleland and Tammy Duckworth. On the other hand, there are lots of public figures who've passed as non-disabled. People like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, who had serious bouts with polio as children. Can we get beyond having to pass? Beyond the metaphors of exclusion? These are some of the questions of our time, which we're focusing on in this film. Next, I wanted to continue with the dual focus on education and culture, and I got to follow up with someone who embodies all in one person arts education, arts advocacy, disability activism, and political engagement. Elisabeth Axel is the president and CEO of Art Beyond Sight, a not-for-profit organization that has worked for decades to bring arts education to people with disabilities and to encourage people to get involved in the arts, as viewers, as staffers, and as creatives. In addition, Elisabeth has a long and extensive resume as an activist through her involvement in Project Access for All, the 504 Democratic Club, and the Disability Pride Parade. Elisabeth, welcome.
Thank you so much, Warren.
You're a veteran disability activist and arts educator, it's fair to say, so let me ask you, how has the general level of public acceptance and awareness of disability, the visibility of disability, changed over your career?
Well, so now I am a white woman who, with my hair pulled back in a yellow headband, and I'm wearing sort of a yellowy shirt in my 60s. And so my career began, Warren, when I was in my 20s. And so that description certainly changed. Regarding the general level of public acceptance and awareness of disability and how it's changed, I've seen a tremendous shift. When I first became involved in this work, disability was often discussed primarily through a medical lens or a service lens. People thought about what disabled people needed rather than what disabled people contributed. Today, we're seeing a broader understanding emerge. People are beginning to recognize disability as part of human diversity and as an important part of our culture, our communities, and our public life. So we're shifting, I feel, from the medical model strongly to the social model, and that's real progress. At the same time, I think we're entering a new chapter. For decades, the disability movement fought for access. We fought for the right to enter schools, workplaces, museums, theaters, and public spaces. Today, we're also building culture. And culture is what turns legal rights into a sense of belonging. The question is no longer simply whether disabled people can participate. The question is how society changes when disabled people fully participate.
And that segues perfectly into my next question, which is, where are we in the arc of the disability revolution?
I think we're moving from access to influence. The disability rights movement made tremendous progress, ranging from the Rehab Act to ADA to independent living centers. And that can largely be attributed to disabled people, some well-known, some lesser known, organizing, activating, advocating, and creating opportunities that didn't exist before. But I think we've moved on from that, and we're asking bigger questions like, who tells the stories? Who designs the institutions? Who leads? Access gets you in the room, but influence lets you shape what happens there. So I think the next phase of disability rights movement is deeply connected to culture, education, leadership, and representation.
Those are the very topics we're covering in this film. And how does the changing of our place in history, as you've just outlined, how does that inform our community's identity?
Well, for a long time, disabled people were nearly invisible in the stories society told about itself. Most people could name famous political leaders, artists, inventors, and activists without realizing how many of those people lived with disabilities. Most disabled young people grew up without learning much about disability history at all. But that's changing now. As we recover our history, we're also recovering a strong sense of our identity. We're beginning to understand that disability isn't only something that happens to individuals, it's also a community, it's a culture, it's a body of knowledge and experience that has shaped our society in countless ways. When young people learn about disability history, they realize they belong to something larger than themselves. And that creates pride. It creates confidence and it creates leadership.
So in terms of the community's presence in the society generally and culturally, pop culture can really help with making our community more visible. The first pop culture piece that positively highlighted people with disabilities, of course, there's a huge heritage of material that presented metaphors that put us in a really bad light. But the first one that put us in a positive light was the TV show Ironside, which was about a spinal cord injury detective who continued fighting crime after he became injured. That show debuted in 1968. It was a long-running hit. It was mandatory viewing in my house growing up. These days, Jenna Bainbridge on Broadway is showing that people with visible disabilities can be on the big-time stage. But, more aspirationally, I'm thinking of the way that shows like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and Will and Grace seem to really have an effect on the broad U.S. culture when it came to the LGBTQ community. It would be great if something like that happened with disability. You can certainly find increasingly disability-related themes and material on stage and in broadcast works. Some of that stuff's a little strained, but a lot of it is surprisingly decent. But nothing's really broken out yet. Your thoughts?
So, a couple of things. One is a shout out to Jenna, who is a very generous person and had come and spoken at the Disability Pride Parade in New York City in 2025. Just a really lovely person. And, that kind of, it's, as people say to me, oh, you must really your day must just be all, moon and stars and just happy go lucky, like you're in arts and culture. And it's true. I love the field of arts and culture, but for me also, it's really like we're in a battle. We must have representation because culture changes people in ways that laws alone can't. A law can be passed in a day, but minds can't be changed in one. The ADA was signed in a day in 1990, but we're still fighting for equitable access and basic respect 36 years later. So while the ADA prohibits discrimination, it might not, for example, convince employers that a wheelchair user with access accommodations can perform a task just as well as a non-disabled person. And that's where culture comes in. For many Americans, people like Jenna, people in television, film, music, social media, storytelling are where they first encounter communities that are different from their own. So the disability community needs authentic representation. but we also need disabled creators. We need disabled writers, directors, artists, musicians, curators, and producers helping shape what stories get told. And we're starting to see that. I think a big challenge is that the goal isn't simply visibility, because that can be done relatively easily by adding a disabled character into a TV show and giving them a couple of lines that might unintentionally, perpetuate a stereotype. The goal is for disability to be seen as a natural and valuable part of the human experience. That's when culture becomes an ally.
And as it becomes easier for the disability community to participate in U.S. culture as consumers and creators, how do you think that might influence the content of the culture?
I think the disability community is one of America's most underappreciated creative resources. Disabled people spend our lives adapting, problem solving, communicating differently, building community differently, and navigating systems that weren't designed with us in mind. I often, my grandmother had a disability. She was blind half of her life. And she would always say to me, Warren, that she said to herself, Judy, use your brain. And I often myself, think back to that and just say, like, okay, I can't navigate this way, but I can figure out a different way to achieve the same end. And often I think that when I've taken the time and I've been thinking about that end, I come out actually with an end that was like at a higher level than I would have when I've went, because of that time that I was candidly forced to take because of my disability. I think that we as disabled people, we create knowledge, we can create creativity, create innovation. So it isn't a question of how culture influences disabled people so much as how disabled people influence culture. People with disabilities are participating more fully as artists, filmmakers, writers, performers, and cultural leaders, which, as someone who began her career focusing solely on accessibility in the arts, it's been remarkable to witness. So we're bringing those perspectives into culture, and that to me enriches culture itself. I'm very hopeful that the progress we've seen so far will continue.
And how has Art Beyond Sight helped to make those changes happen?
What we try to do, what we've always understood, is social movements need laws. Social movements need institutions, and every social movement needs culture. Laws change what people can do. Culture changes what people believe. It's now almost 40 years that Art Beyond Sight has worked to make sure disabled people can fully participate in cultural life, not only as audience members, but as artists, educators, creators, and leaders, whether it's through museum accessibility, audio description, multisensory engagement, professional development, or partnerships with cultural institutions. The goal has always been larger than accommodation. The goal is participation. And when people can contribute to culture, culture itself becomes stronger.
And continuing now with the thread of education, how has the state of disability history as a subject in our educational system, both higher ed and K-12, what is the state of that?
Don't get me started. You know,
I'm asking to get you started.
yeah, we've made progress, but disability history remains far too invisible. Many students can graduate without ever learning about Judy Heumann, the 504 sit-in, the disability rights movement, disability arts, independent living movement, deaf culture, or the countless disabled leaders who help shape our society. That's a problem because history tells us who belongs. When disability history is missing, students receive the message that disabled people were spectators rather than participants. We were not weak. We were central. We are central. The truth is exactly opposite. Disabled people have always helped shape America. We simply haven't done a good enough job telling that story.
Part of my thought on this topic is in my work as a historian, I've found that our stories aren't that well known even within our community. And if we don't know our stories, it's not really fair to expect other people to. But with that in
That's
mind,
very, very true. And that's why we're so grateful for the column in your website, Warren.
well, thank you. But in terms of moving disability history out into a more general societal understanding or awareness, how can we raise the profile of disability history as a general interest subject? I think it most of the time, disability studies courses are enrolled by people with disabilities. What can we do about that?
Sorry for that. Of course, um, of course, we need the basics: curriculum, teacher training, educational standards, everything to teach students in a structured way. But I actually think culture often leads to education. Students are constantly learning, and it's not just from classrooms. Anytime they go to a museum, they go to a festival, they watch a documentary, they see public art, they browse social media, they're learning. You know, we have wonderful student interns from City University of New York, disabled and non-disabled, and it's it's in that experiential moment of working side by side together that it just becomes a new normal. So one reason I care also about disability arts and disability culture is that they create curiosity and they give people a space to ask questions. And once people start asking questions, they want to learn more. Disability history needs to be in schools, but it also belongs as a part of our public life.
I think that we need to get people in to schools, giving guest appearances, guest lectures, things that will raise our profile. But what
I love
action,
that.
what actions outside of school can lead towards broader disability education efforts within school? We've already touched on a few, but let's talk about that some more.
Disability pride celebrations, for one, community storytelling, public art, museums, festivals, oral histories, documentaries. All of these things shape public understanding. I've seen it firsthand through the Disability Pride NYC Parade, Disability Unite Festival, and cultural programs across New York City. People often encounter disability culture for the first time through an event, through an exhibition, a performance, or a conversation. Those experiences create awareness. That awareness creates demand for education, and eventually schools respond. Culture teaches before schools teach. And along the same note as what you were saying before, Warren, about our own community, I think that we also are broad as a community. Perhaps we're within the blindness community and we don't know a tremendous amount about the deaf community or about, the Paralympic community of wheelchair users who are doing like amazing things in surfing and or people with rock climbing or whatever. We need to broaden as a community our own understandings about other disability communities, respecting that we are all one culture and we also together are separate, unique cultures. And also within those separate, unique cultures, we also have all different interests as we become knowledgeable about each other. It's, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not only about awareness for non-disabled allies, it's also public understanding within our own disability communities to enrich our own understandings about each other.
So in this film, we're sort of slip sliding in between, among, and around education, culture, which of course takes in a huge array of topics, culture within the disability community, culture outside the disability community, educational culture, political culture, arts culture. So taking a slightly different angle, how can we use education to get broader recognition for our community and our place in society?
Education helps people see what has always been there. When people learn disability history, disability culture, and disability contributions, I think they begin to understand that disability is not a side story. It's a part of the American story. Education moves people beyond stereotypes. It helps them see disabled people as neighbors, artists, workers, leaders, innovators, educators, and community builders. And for disabled young people, that can be transformative. It tells them that they belong. It tells them that they have a history, and it tells them that they are part of an awesome future.
Now, when I introduced you, I described you as sort of having dual careers or dual roles as an educator and an activist. How do those fit together as vehicles for the change and progress that you've been talking about?
For me, I've never really separated them, Warren. Education changes how people think. Activism changes how systems work. And we need both. You can create a more accessible policy, but if people don't understand why it matters, progress is limited. You can change attitudes, but if institutions don't change, barriers remain. The most successful movements combine education, advocacy, culture, and community. And that's what I've tried to do throughout my career.
But I'm going to ask you once again about the separate roles. I understand that you inhabiting them, you don't separate them, but notwithstanding, I'm going to. How would you assess the impact that each branch of your career has had for the community and for the culture more broadly?
What connects all of my work is the belief that participation matters deeply, whether it's through Art Beyond Sight, Project Access, Disability Pride, Disability Unite, Museum Accessibility, cultural program, education, or advocacy. The goal has always been to expand participation, to help disabled people not only access society, but help shape it. And I've seen that deeply, deeply with my work with the 504 Democratic Club. Like you watch as people come back year after year and people see the world and their ability to impact the world in dramatic shifts in individuals. I've been very fortunate to see people encounter disability culture for the first time. I've seen institutions change. artists find audiences, communities grow. And I've seen people who once felt isolated discover that they belong to something much larger. And those moments matter. And that's how social change becomes real.
You mentioned isolation in your answer just now, and I want to follow up on that. Not too long ago, we were almost completely segregated and isolated from each other and invisible. We're less segregated and more visible today, but the legacy of segregation is still with us. There are the recent attacks on Section 504 and other hard-won gains. There's our own continuing inward focus. And I mean, our inward focus is entirely understandable from a historical standpoint, but I think it inadvertently tends to keep people out. And it's something we can all help to change. The next phase of the disability revolution has to involve us getting out into the general society and drawing people in so that our stories get heard. And the Disability Pride Parade could be a great vehicle. But so far it's been pretty small. And so what are your thoughts on changing our community's inward focus to draw in the general population and help build the Disability Pride Parade, among other things? And, you know, dare I say, perhaps attract a little corporate sponsorship.
I had just gotten off 3 emails about corporate sponsorship, and it sounds promising. I think the future really depends upon building those bridges that you're talking about. We need spaces that are created by and for the disability community. Those spaces are essential, but we also need opportunities for the broader public to engage. The Disability Pride Parade, the Disability Unite Festival, and similar events work because they bring people together through culture. People come for music, they come for art, they come for community. And while they're there, they discover disability culture, disability history, and disability pride. And that's how movements grow, not by closing themselves off, but like you're saying, Warren, getting bigger, bolder, prouder, and inviting people in.
So spiraling out to a much more general question, or 2 more general questions. How else can we move the disability revolution forward that we haven't covered?
I love the words disability revolution. I haven't heard them before. So I'm encouraging you, keep that going, Warren. That's awesome. I think we move that revolution forward by recognizing that disability isn't a niche issue. It's one of the defining conversations of the 21st century. As our population ages, as technology evolves, as conversations about design, caregiving, health, workforce participation, veterans, and human diversity continue to grow, disability becomes increasingly relevant to everyone. The disability community has been thinking about these issues for generations. We have experience, we have knowledge, we have solutions, and more importantly, we have vision, a vision of a society where accessibility is expected, where participation is valued, and where human diversity is recognized as strength. To me, that's what a more accessible union means, not simply making room for us disabled people, but recognizing that disabled people help shape our shared future. And when that happens, everyone benefits.
Yes, I think the special gift or accomplishment of our movement is that it is based on an actualized, a functioning view of common humanity and moving every component of the disability community's coalition forward. I think that is a shining example that that others could profit from. Now, disability has always existed. It will always exist. And we're talking now in sort of broad strokes, looking beyond the issues of today. And let me ask you to cast your eyes into the future. Where do you see the disability revolution 30 years from now?
Wowza, what a question. It could go one of two ways, Warren. No, because on the negative end, the how many times am I retraining an art museum where I've trained them to become accessible before, and the staff changed. And so the thought leadership of their access program wasn't continued. And how many times when governments change, electeds change, are we having to fight around again where we had the money before, we had the partnership before, and we need to go at it again? And how many people who are part of this access revolution don't even know they don't know the stories of why we do what we do and how we do it. Not to say that they couldn't choose to do things differently, but it would be good for people to be educated. So when you say 30 years from now, I'll share with you what I'm trying to do about shaping that 30 years from now, which is I'm deeply working with the next generation, just deeply working with the next generation of disabled youth and non-disabled allied youth. Because I think that if we help to teach them what was our history and what are our needs, they're a part of shaping the future for that 30 years. And the interest has been so fantastic. That's where a group of young people began a project called Inclusive Futures. They're disabled people, non-disabled allied youth, ages from middle school up through young professionals. And so they're telling me what to do.
That's
That's the best.
great.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're going to leave it, Elisabeth. This has been really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was glad to get away from the emails.
Well, now
Thanks,
you can go
Warren.
back to them.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Speaking with Elisabeth was a high-level stroll through the world of ideas and expression, but it was also tempered by the wisdom drawn from her battles as an activist and her on-the-ground work as an arts educator and advocate. After speaking with the educators, Chris and Elisabeth, I wanted to move into a more specifically political conversation in order to cover that aspect of our subject matter and evolving U.S. culture. I'm very pleased to introduce Mike Schweinsburg. Mike is a longtime disability rights and disability justice advocate and the president of the 504 Democratic Club, a citywide political club focused on the disability community, which works within the electoral political system to help ensure that the community's issues are heard and that its policy needs are responded to. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Warren. Thank you. Good to be here.
So, where are we in the arc of the disability revolution?
Certainly at a place far better than we have been in previous decades, certainly in previous eras. When I review our history, I believe it begins with the caveman, who the cavemen put their disabled family members, infants, and like out of the cave because they wouldn't be productive to the clan. So we were the first, I always maintain, to be discriminated against. And there are many, many times in history where civilizations made ceremonies out of throwing disabled babies into fires or throwing them over cliffs, or there's also the instance in middle times in the 1600s. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the phrase is for that, but where the good King of England offered an edict saying that only the frail and impaired could beg on the streets, otherwise begging was illegal. You might know that as a time that from whence the term handicap comes, because of cap in hand. But we were relegated to being beggars. There's a fast forward to the 1938, and we have the Congress I guess they thought a good heart, passing the subminimum wage bill. What other minority would accept that? We're expected to. And then there was the awful instance of Willowbrook. And we all know that horror story. But the thinking prevalent at that time was, who cares? They're disabled. So, okay, we've come quite some way. And I'd like to say that in modern times, and in New York City, New York State to a degree too, 504 has been contributory to advancing the public's perception of people with disabilities. That's one of the battles we're engaged in. There are too many myths and just misconceptions about who we are, why we are, where we are. And we're everywhere. We're part of every single segment of society. We're totally intersectional. And 60% of our population come from communities of color. Still, that doesn't allow elected officials, candidates, and policymakers, when they're enumerating all the marginalized communities they seek to protect, mention or include people with disabilities. However, we've made tremendous progress particularly in the last couple of decades. We're actually sitting with legislators, writing legislation beneficial to our community, and many legislative leaders are now only looking through the disability lens when they draft legislation or review legislation from their colleagues. That is a tremendous advancement. And so I think that's why 504 is around, because we advocate for disability rights and disability justice politically. I believe that's where it needs to come from. When the politicians talk about it, the press hears it, the press starts talking about it, the public takes their cue from the electeds and the press, and some of those misconceptions about us begin to lessen or evaporate, and they have in some cases.
So we're covering a range of subject matter that goes from education to culture and back again. Starting with education, what is the state of disability and disability history as a subject in our educational system, both higher ed and K to 12? And how has that changed over the course of your career? Disability studies courses tend to attract enrollment by students with disabilities. How can we raise the profile of disability history as a more general interest subject in the education system?
So to do that, we have to look at history. We have to look at how other minorities have run that gauntlet. Go back to the early days of Black studies. The more recent, but certainly expanding, And we're talking about higher education now, right? LGBTQ studies. They are trying not to use the word rampant, but they're certainly across all colleges and universities. Disability studies, unfortunately, seem reserved for the disabled. How do we make that change? Really, you got to go back further. You got to get the secondary grades to be offering it. They have to. Young people have to have some grounding in this. Our community deserves that minimal respect, that there is something taught in high schools about our community and the advancements we've made, the talents we have, the history we have, the rich history we have,
Now,
which is the same formula that every other marginalized community is instructed on. We deserve the same.
We, the disability community, can make ourselves more of a part of the educational system, even if it's through guest appearances and adjunct work and that kind of thing. I think the next phase of the disability revolution is going to have to involve us getting out into the general society and drawing them in so we can tell our stories. But part of what I encounter in my work as a historian is that the story of disability and the disability rights movement isn't well known even in our community. And if we don't know our stories, how can we expect other people to?
I
Now,
brought up that very, I'm sorry, go ahead.
continue.
I brought up that very point when I was a guest lecturer at Columbia, invited by Professor Frontes, who used to be Assemblymember Frontes, who asked me to address her students. And the very lively conversation that followed my address was encouraging, very encouraging. But there aren't a lot of Matilda Fronteses out there to do that. We have to get to the professors and get them to take the interest and let us present, because look, these were, I believe, largely non-disabled students who wanted more. To open their eyes, they want more.
That's very encouraging. And, you know, what I like to think about this is history basically has three elements: great stories that are well told, that change the perceptions of the people hearing them. We have great stories, and we have a lot of them. We need more people to tell them. In a nutshell, I think that's where it is. So turning now to matters outside the educational system. You've been around a while. It's fair to say you're a veteran activist. So let me ask you, how has the general level of public acceptance and awareness of disability, the visibility of disability, if I can borrow Alice Wong's phrase, how has that changed over your career?
Well, considerably. I understand it's 25 years I've been doing this, and understand that when I joined it, I didn't know I had a disability. When I first joined, I was mentored by Marvin Wasserman, because I dedicated my life to activism, first on behalf of the LGBT community. And I said, look, they got lots of people working with them. Here's a community that really needs a champion, or people that help the effort. And through that, those discussions, early discussions with Marvin, almost clinically, he said, Mike. So self-awareness is first, right? Certainly that made me redouble my efforts. But there are many ways. And, I organized New York City's first disability pride parade and the intent behind that. And I don't want to say the failing of the current or later ones. In any event, it seems to have lost its emphasis on changing the perception of people of the public with regard to people with disabilities. And the way to do that is using it as a vehicle to generate press, but particularly pre-press. We had a lot of that for the first one. And then make sure the press follows up on it. There were 200 press hits after that first Disability Pride Parade. Now go and search for press hits since.
You know, I think that part of what's going on with the Pride Parade, which I agree could be a great vehicle, it comes out of the legacy of segregation, which appears in the recent attacks on Section 504 and other gains which aren't as bulletproof as we thought, in our own continuing inward focus as a community, which is understandable from a historical standpoint, but I think it tends to keep people out. And I think that shows in the parade. It's been pretty small. It hasn't drawn big crowds. What can we do to make it more celebratory, more welcome, get bigger audiences, maybe some corporate sponsorship? I mean, you know, we don't have the problem that the Gay Pride Parade has of corporate sponsorship to the point where people are resenting it. No, we do not have that issue.
Ain't got that problem yet.
Yep.
Long way from that problem.
So what are your thoughts?
Look, I believe that every community, every marginalized community has come up as a result, direct result of things like parades, entertainment, arts and culture, all of that. That is the very best way to educate others on your particular community. And arts and culture is a very inviting way of doing it. Things like a parade. I'm not going to tell you the one that goes, but there's that joke about, I love a parade. Well, if you know it, that was funny. If not, it wasn't. But everybody loves a parade is the basis of that story. And that can be handled properly, a chief vehicle. Disability arts and culture in general is another excellent way of tearing down the misconceptions, the myths about us, which I found, sadly, to be that we are a community of beggars and scammers. That is now, certainly that's shocking to anybody involved in the movement because we're inward looking, but the public perception is far different. The New York Post impression, in other words, far, far different. We have to, and the way to change that is through cultural exchange, work, as we are totally intersectional. We should be working with every community to have disability events, meaningful, informative disability events. And yes, our own parade. I know that when I first did it, I'll tell you what aggravated the hell out of me is people continually telling me, Mike, why aren't you doing this in June with the other Pride events? Excuse me? They don't own Pride.
Right.
So,
Now,
struggling for identity.
Living in a media-saturated culture as we do, pop culture could really help with making our community more visible. And there is an increasing presence of
That's right.
disability in our pop culture. I think some of that stuff is a little strained, but a lot of it is surprisingly decent. And
like that show we saw with Matthew Whitaker?
yes, Matthew Whitaker, for those who don't know, is a blind jazz piano player. Mike and I went to see his band about a year ago, and they just tore the roof off the place.
Right, the blue note, as it were. Yeah.
Yes. Now, what I'm thinking of, though, is the way that shows like Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and Will and Grace seem to really have an effect on the broad U.S. culture when it came to the LGBTQ community
Right.
and its perception.
Right.
It would be great if something like that could happen with disability.
Oh,
Obviously,
ours
nothing
would
has
be
broken through on that level yet.
no, and ours would be far more entertaining. Uh, you know, far from being stereotypical. We have such a diverse community that that could be an unending source of joy and entertainment and awareness. Yes, absolutely. It's a wide open field, and they're missing the boat by not doing it. But then there were Atypical. That was a brilliant series on TV about an autistic youth, and it did not matter which disabled, non-disabled, everybody who was exposed to that, unfortunately, didn't get the kind of exposure it needed, but found it extremely entertaining. There are
You're
a
referring
great
to Big Bang Theory?
no Atypical. It's called.
Ah,
You haven't heard it?
no.
Google. Check it out. You will love me for recommending it. It is such. Marvin actually turned me on to it, and I'm so grateful for it because it is a laugh riot. Um, Characters are finely etched, and it is very informative. So yeah,
So let's turn now from culture broadly to institutional and political changes. One way to raise community visibility is to build political alliances so that we can shape policy. And by shaping policy, we can help shape the culture and our future. How is the 504 Democratic Club helping to make those changes happen?
well, um, I'd almost say I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm a little prejudiced on the matter, but I can only say honestly, tremendously. Um, we have. I'm trying to resist saying, but okay, we've gained a lot of power. We have our relations with our elected officials in Washington D.C., in Albany, and at City Hall is miles apart from where it was just a couple of decades ago. Um, and as our attorney, Arthur Schwartz, who's a renowned civil rights and labor attorney, says, they're scared of you. And uh, to me, I just see them as respectful, but they certainly do. And they're open. We have so many instances of their growing awareness, involvement, and advocacy for us. Um, I think we can be pleased with the progress. We cannot be satisfied, but we can be pleased. There has been a lot of progress over the years. Most legislators, I'd like to believe, do look at their legislation through a disability lens, or at least their committees do, because legislation has to go through a committee. And the committees finally see to it that, wait a minute, how does this affect the largest minority? That kind of awareness is growing. Not so much, I'm not going to tell you it's, growing by leaps and bounds in Washington, D.C., but
No, it's
City Hall
growing
for sure.
backwards in Washington, D.C.
Well, thanks to a certain White House, yeah, and a certain orange man. Yes. But um, in Albany, it's growing, and in City Hall, it's grown tremendously.
So, on a more broad level, what other ways can we move the disability revolution forward? And where do you see the revolution 30 years from now?
Yeah, for everybody.
Me too,
Uh,
pal.
yeah, yeah. You know, the sense I get is that there's been I've seen in my lifetime such such a tangible difference that I'm very optimistic that we will be fully recognized as not just the largest minority, but really when you get to know us, we're the most vibrant, diverse group of people who you never knew. To know us is to love us. We should all remain engaged in the battle of first self-awareness and then public acceptance. Because, I say, there's a reluctance for companies to hire us until they hire us. Then they find out that we're the most loyal, the hardest working, most talented. This keeps coming back, and this is from our controller, Tom DiNapoli, to, city leaders and like that. Everybody real, and I cite Tom because he has particular programs related to that. And he's been such a great ally over the last 18 years. He's been great. But yeah, the agencies in government are recognizing it. And my only complaint with them is they don't promote it as well as they certainly give us a lip service. They tell, oh, I get, and they make certain efforts, but not the kind of efforts that the largest minority deserves. But I'm happy with the progress. I'm just not satisfied.
Knowing you, I don't think you ever will be.
You're right.
And I think we can leave it there, Mike. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mike is a fighter, so focused on the next battle up ahead and on the battles that didn't go the way he'd have liked that it's sometimes difficult for him to acknowledge his own contributions, the changes he's been a part of. I'm grateful to have people like Mike Schweinsburg in our movement. In our sort of romp through education, politics, arts, and culture, it's undeniable that there's an increasing, though still modest, presence of people with disabilities on stage, in theaters, and on TV. In order to pick up on that piece of the evolving culture in the United States, this film would not be complete unless I spoke with someone on the cutting edge of bringing disability out and into the general audience. Jenna Bainbridge is a New York City-based actor, singer, and disability rights advocate. In 2024, in the musical Suffs, Jenna became the first wheelchair user to originate a role in a new Broadway musical. She went on to become the first actually disabled person to play the role of the wheelchair-using Nessa Rose in Wicked on Broadway, where she's currently performing 8 shows a week. Jenna hopes to normalize the visibility of ambulatory wheelchair users through her stage work and advocates for accessibility in the arts, partly through her theater accessibility consulting organization, ConsultAbility. Jenna, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to dive into these topics with you.
So, Jenna, we are here to talk about the intersections among education, culture, disability history, and the disability community. Your work on Broadway, in Suffs, and now in Wicked is pioneering in that you're a visibly disabled performer who's on the big-time stage, appearing in works that are not primarily about disability and are being presented to primarily non-disabled audiences. You've said that we can only accept and embrace our differences if we can publicly see and talk about them, and what's more public than the arts? How is your work on stage, as an advocate and as a consultant, affecting public acceptance and awareness of disability?
The thing that I hear the most from audience members is some variation of seeing disability represented on stage made me accept it more in my own life, whether I get messages all the time from people who have said, that they were reluctant to acknowledge that they had a disability or that they needed to use a wheelchair, for example, until they had seen a path, a version of disability that matched and mirrored their own experiences. And I hear so often from people that they had never had these conversations with their families about, about disability and about what happens when we acquire disabilities. How would that affect our lives? And it's these really important conversations that I think oftentimes people are reluctant to. We as a society are not great about talking about disability and how ubiquitous it really is. I mean, I always acknowledge the fact that I think that disability is what happens if you're lucky, because the other option tends to be that you die before you acquire a disability, right? So many people are born with disabilities. Many people acquire disabilities. It is a fact of life and a beautiful thing to be aware of and to discuss. And by telling disabled stories, because every story I tell is about disability simply by nature of me being in that show. I'm going to bring my disability and my disabled experience to any role I play. Every story at least discusses disability in some way, shape, or form. And I hope that that allows audiences to open a dialogue in their own lives to discuss the intersection of disability in their own lives.
So as you're saying, your very presence on stage is raising the visibility of disability in the general population. Can you talk a little about how you knock down the walls to get there?
I am a very stubborn human. That has always been at the very core of my identity. Ever since I was a very small child, I have been stubborn. And when I hear no, it motivates me to try again. So every time I would audition for a show and be told no, I would say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board. I want to train and work and practice so much that I can become good enough that they can't tell me no, that my disability is just a small factor of my castability. So I would always, I hear no, and I would go back to a voice lesson. I'd hear no, I'd go back to dance classes. So I think that my stubbornness and my persistence of continuing to work at the craft itself, but also I'd hear no, and I would go back and audition again the next show that director was doing, the next show that theater company was having. And I noticed a pattern where I am almost never cast from a first audition. That is not my experience. My experience has been, it's the third or fourth time that a director sees me that they would say, oh, what if this character had a disability? And then they would start thinking about me before they built their shows, before they had an impression of who that character was. They would already be thinking about, well, what if Jenna played this character? So it was stubbornness and tenacity that I think opened some of those doors for me. But my goal is always to keep that door open and to make it more accessible for the next person. If I can get in the room, then I can have a conversation with them about the barriers that are preventing people with disabilities from being in those rooms all the time. Because we are 20% of the population or more, depending on the metrics we're looking at. But currently on film and TV roles, it's being portrayed by 1% of these characters have disabilities. And that number is even smaller on stage representation. So I try to I'm stubborn, and I get in the room, and then I try to show them why they need to continue making steps to become more accessible and to cast more disabled talent, and also to have disabled talent everywhere, have them backstage, have them directing and designing.
There is an increasing amount of disability-related themes and performers on stage, in theaters, on TV. The reality TV shows can get a little strained, in my opinion, but a lot of that material is surprisingly decent. And I have to admit, I really like the show Special on Netflix. Ryan O'Connell is quite a talent. Still, nothing's really broken out yet. The most prominent pop culture, or I guess broadcast culture take involving disability so far is probably the old TV show Ironside with Raymond Burr,
Yeah.
which was mandatory viewing in my household growing up. Uh, do you see a time, I mean, let's think aspirationally, do you see a time when pop culture can become an ally in a big way, like the way Queer Eye for a Straight Guy and Will and Grace seem to do for the LGBTQ community?
Oh, 100%. I always, there's a great Oscar Wilde quote that I quote, I say it far too often, but Oscar Wilde says, life imitates art far more than art imitates life. And I think about that daily. We want our lives to look like the art that we consume. And, everyone has a different definition of what art is. Reality TV is art in its very own way, and theater and ballet are art in their own ways. And but I think that if we can have disability representation, good disability representation in those mediums, we become more comfortable with it in our own lives, and it could be this example, this bastion for what disability inclusion and accessibility can look like. It gives an example for people on how to be accessible and how to be inclusive if it's in our homes, as we're watching it on TV, or if we're, reading books about disability. Like it just normalizes it.
So, not too many decades ago, we were almost completely segregated, isolated from each other, and invisible. We're less segregated and less invisible today, but the legacy of segregation is still with us, among other things, in our continuing inward focus as a community. I think the next phase of the disability revolution has to involve us getting out into the general society to tell our stories and become, so to speak, more ordinary, less inward looking so that we draw people in. What are your thoughts on changing our community's inward focus so that we draw in more of the general population?
I think both are so important. I think that one of the ways in which I personally was able to become comfortable with my disability and comfortable asking for access and accommodations was by having a community of disabled people around me. That was where I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about other people and their disabilities and their access needs. That was so formative for me. So I think it's so important that we have those communities, we have those inward moments, and that we don't let that prevent us from also having external communities as well. Theater has always been my home, has always been my family. And I have a disabled theater community that I return to again and again and again to find solace and peace and strength. And then I can go back out into these worlds that are not built for me and that are not completely accessible. And I have the strength to interact with those communities. And for me, it's been a lot of education. Every room I go into, I'm not just hired as an actor. I also end up being an advocate. I end up being an educator. And I'm happy to do that because I think it's important, but it's two jobs. I am a consultant as much as I am a performer. And often I'm only being paid for one of those jobs. So by being able to return to my community again and again, I can find that strength to go back out and keep working. But that's not for everybody. No one should have to be a consultant or an advocate if it's not something they're interested in doing. We should be able to just interact with the space as we are and just be there to do our job. But currently I've found I have to really do both. And by having my community, I'm able to do that.
As it becomes easier for the disability community to participate in U.S. culture, both as consumers and as creators, how might that influence the content of the culture?
Could you repeat that again?
Sure. As it becomes easier for the disability community to participate in U.S. culture, both as consumers and as creators, how might that influence the content of the culture? Inviting you to look a little ways ahead now.
Yeah. I'm so excited for this future. I am so excited I think that the first step is going to be having disabled people telling stories about our experience. And, I'm excited to see a show written by a disabled playwright and directed by a disabled director and designed by disabled designers and performed by disabled actors. I want that story. What I'm also excited for is the future in which disability is not at the heart of the story. I want to see disabled characters where disability is not a plot point. They just have a disability. They just exist in the world. And it doesn't matter. We don't need to talk about how they became disabled or what they're doing to manage their disability, or none of these are plot points, because in life, it really shouldn't be, right? I don't owe my history to anybody I'm having a conversation with, no matter what they think. And no matter how many times they might ask, they do not need to know my history. They do not need to know what my disability is. So I'm very excited for the world in which that becomes an example, where we can see those interactions where disability is just normalized and accepted. I'm really looking forward to that future. And I think as we become more visible, as we have more and more, disabled people in pop culture, I hope that becomes a completely normalized experience.
I completely agree with you. And I think the big breakout moment, when it comes, is going to involve a story in which disability is not central.
Mm-hmm.
It's merely an element that appears among the constellation of subplots and characters and so forth.
Mm-hmm. You
Yeah.
brought up reality TV before, and there's on Love Island this season. There is a Paralympian is on Love Island this year. And it has been, I haven't really been watching much, but the memes that I see make me so happy, because it's definitely something she talks about, that she has a disability. But it very quickly became just like every other Love Island plot line of like, she's just part of this game show. And I think it's such a great example of, it so quickly becomes normalized. We address it and we move on, and now we're all just living in this world together.
All right, let's move to the educational side of things a bit. What was the state of disability as a subject in your educational experience, and how much do you think it's changed, if at all, since then?
Disability was not part of my education at all. I did not really recognize that I had a disability until I was in middle school. I knew that, I had a disability. I knew that I interacted with the world in a different way. I knew that people treated me differently, or would bully me. I understood that, but I didn't understand what disability was. I didn't understand how huge it was. And I, for a long time, really tried to hide my disability because it felt easier. I didn't want people staring at me. I didn't want people asking me questions. And I learned, at one point, I needed to wear a large knee brace. And what happened was suddenly people started treating me better. I recognized when I went out in public, if I was walking with a knee brace, people just assumed that I had a temporary injury, and I was treated better. And that was my first time of like really realizing, oh, I have a disability, but I could pretend that this is something, commonplace, because it is. But, I was like, I could lean into this. And that was really an interesting moment for me, finally realizing, we didn't talk about disability in school. We didn't have disabled characters in the books we were reading. We didn't talk about disability history or disability movements. I didn't know any of these things. And it wasn't until I was in middle school and started working with Family Theater Company, which hires entirely actors with disabilities. And I was introduced to an entire community of disabled people who taught me the history and taught me about disability acceptance and love. And that was when I stopped hiding it. That was when I started embracing it. And I would fully, I would go into auditions and be like, hey, what's up? I'm Jenna. Here's my disability. Whereas before it was like, I would try to hide it with like, oh, I'll just like wear a knee brace or I'll just film my audition from the waist up and they won't ever notice. These were things that went through my mind because I had people constantly doing that for me. Like I had directors as a kid who would tell me, oh, just stand behind the desk and never walk. And that way no one will know, which is a horrible thing to do to a child. And, I internalized so much from that. I thought I had to hide. And I wish that there had been education. I wish that I knew that I wasn't alone, because in my school, I felt alone. I was the only disabled kid in my school. And I really wish I'd had a community from the beginning, but I'm so glad I got a community as young as I was. I was 12 years old when I did finally meet other disabled people, and it changed my life for the better.
I think we need to get out into schools in order to raise the profile of disability history as a subject in our educational system.
Mm-hmm.
What I often encounter in my work as a historian, though, is that our stories, disability history, disability activism, those stories aren't well known even in our own community. And I wonder whether it's fair to expect other people to know our stuff if we don't.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts about raising the visibility of disability history in generalized education?
Disability is such a hard community to have, lore that is passed down and shared, because it's not necessarily kept within families. It's not passed from one generation to the next in the same way. Disability can affect anybody at any moment in their lives. And so you join a community that you don't know anything about. So I think it does actually need to be in the full society in order for it to also be in our communities, because our community comes from everywhere. So, those of us who do know the stories and do know the history, it is kind of on us to tell everybody, to make it a story that anybody knows. Because then when they acquire a disability, or when their partner does, or their child does, or their grandmother does, they already know the lore. It's baked into our society. If it's kept within our community, then it dies within our community. We have to really share it.
I think that's exactly on target. I think the absence of lore, of oral history, stems from our history of isolation, the fact that disability typically doesn't run in families and cross generations, that there aren't people to get that history from or tell it to, at least not until fairly recently.
Yeah, and our community was so isolated for so long. A lot of people with disabilities were kept completely separate. They didn't have a community to share their experiences with. And that still happens. So we have to tell people what is happening within our community and how we are being affected by, maybe it's old laws that are still in effect. There's so many of those, but there's also new legislation coming up all the time that we have to be talking about. Hey, have you heard about the 504 sit-ins? Let's talk about this. This is a huge moment in history that has actually affected every other movement. It's the largest sit-in, the longest sit-in in US history, is part of the disability rights movement. And we can learn a lot from that and apply it to other movements. And let's also talk about, the bus riots. And let's also talk about all of these moments that have shaped American history and world history. A lot of them intersect with the disability community, but we have to keep telling those stories.
I will add to what you just said that the first sit-in, in addition to the longest sit-in, the first sit-in was an action by the League of the Physically Handicapped.
Yep, in the 1930s, right?
Yes, in the mid-1930s, when they went into the local office of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration in New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and demanded to be seen by the head of the office. And when he refused to meet with them, they refused to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the sit-in became a fundamental strategy during the civil rights era. But just think how logical a sit-in is if you're a protester who uses crutches.
Yes. Yes. Well, and it was so interesting working on Suffs because there's a lot of parallels that happened within the women's suffrage movement where we're not teaching children about the women's suffrage movement. I knew almost nothing about it when I joined Suffs. All I knew was, something about Susan B. Anthony and Katie B. Stanton and Seneca Falls. That was the extent of my knowledge. I knew nothing about when the movement actually passed. I didn't know what year that was. I didn't know who the major players were. I didn't know anything about it. And, the women's suffrage movement had one of the first marches on Washington. So, this is in 1913, the first women's march. And it's, a march in DC is a pretty popular tool now. And it really started with the women's suffrage movement. So, there's a lot of these parallels of, I think sometimes history books don't want to show people, here's how rights were won. Because it's, there's unrest in that. There's civil upheaval in that. But that's a good thing because that's where we get this progress from. So I think it's so important that we tell these stories, even if they're not in our history books, because we need to know, we need to have a roadmap for how to continue to make progress.
So I saw you on Wicked on Broadway a few weeks ago, and you were wonderful.
Thank you.
And I really, really enjoyed the play, which I thought was concise and focused, more so than the movies were.
Our show, this always makes me laugh. Our show, the entire 2-act experience of seeing Wicked on Broadway is shorter than watching just the first movie, which is always so baffling to me.
Yeah.
Both are beautiful, but the stage show is very concise and very quick.
There was one thing that surprised me, though, a little bit. Your character, Nessa Rose, seems to have no prejudice or rejection aimed at her at all, which is, of course, very much unlike the situation confronted by her green-skinned sister, Elphaba, who has nothing but rejection aimed at her, or almost. To the extent that your character's disability is an issue in the play, it seems to come from feelings that emanate from the character internally. And I'm not sure that that's an accurate reflection of disability in American society today, but on the other hand, I don't know that the play purports to be an accurate reflection. They're out in Oz, wherever the heck that is.
Yeah.
But I am wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I think it's an example of, well, first off, the character of Nessa Rose, her disability was changed from the book to stage. In the book, Nessa is born without any arms. And on stage, they changed her disability to being a wheelchair user. So I think that some of the nuances of disability were omitted in the stage adaptation, partly because they were changing the storytelling of like her specific disability and the way she interacted with the world. But also, there wasn't a lot of disabled input in the room. So I think that, I want disabled people to be in every single room. I think that is so important. It without disabled people telling their own stories, we have non-disabled assumptions of what they think something would be. And so I think that any movie, any book, any play that is talking about disability and was written and directed and designed without disabled input is not going to be accurate of the disabled disabled experience. And I love being in Wicked. I think that it's such a blast. But it is certainly not my experience of what it was like to be in school. But also,
Yeah.
I didn't have any green classmates, and I didn't have magic, and I didn't have there's a lot of other things that weren't in my school experience.
Yes, and the reliance on assumptions by non-disabled people tend to draw on the legacy of fictional metaphors and other material about disability, which puts us in a very othering light,
Agreed.
very forbidding, encouraging them to keep their distance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You
And
know,
it also
and
comes down
and
to every show eventually becomes a period piece. Every show, no matter how modern it is when it's first written, it gets frozen in time, and reflects the attitudes and opinions of an era. And for Wicked, that means that it's a period piece of 2002. What were the attitudes and opinions on every subject in it? It's 2002, and a lot has changed in the last 25 years.
And with the period piece question in mind and the sequence of history, where are we in the arc of the disability revolution, do you think?
Honestly, like, if we're looking at a scale of like 1 to 10, of 1 is we've just started and 10 is like, yay, we did it. It feels like we're at like a 3. Like, I feel like there's so much movement that has happened. And my hope is that it's just, maybe the arc of revolution is like a triangle. So it's like an uphill battle to get to that 5. And then we get momentum on our side to get to 10. But my gosh, I mean, we've been going at this for generations, and I still feel like there's so much to go before we can have the momentum behind us to carry us all the way to justice. But my hope is that we're past the halfway point on the climb. That's my hope.
And I'm going to invite you now to cast your eye far into the distance. Where do you see the disability revolution 30 years from now?
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, if we're looking at the ADA being passed roughly 30 years ago, 30 years in the future, my hope is that at least the physical barriers are mostly removed within the next 30 years. I think that societal and systemic attitudes sometimes take longer to change, but if we can have the physical barriers removed, I think that would be my goal in the next 30 years. Now, granted, New York City subway has announced that they will make every single station accessible in, I think they said 50 years from now. So, maybe within 30 years, we won't have full access. But my hope is that we have plans in place for everything to be fully accessible in the next generation. Because then once we can have every room accessible to people, then we can get into the room and start having conversations about how to change hearts and minds as well as physical barriers.
I love that wish. I share your concerns about the New York City subway system, which has been described as the largest piece of Victorian machinery in the world.
It is accurate.
And I think we can leave it there, Jenna. Thank you ever so much. This has just been fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a joy.
Take care.
Thank you. You as well.
Bye-bye. The energy, the determination, and the wide-ranging scope of Jenna's understanding really filled me with hope for our future. That our community is producing people of such talent constitutes a promise of continued progress and even greatness long after the people I've known and worked with, and long after I myself have left the stage. By now, we've covered a lot of territory: education, many components of culture, politics, arts, the legacy of segregation. We have established, I think, that the disability revolution is well underway, but also that it has a long way to go. As we went through our topics and our conversations, though, I began wondering about something. What can the disability rights movement offer to the culture of the United States at large at this moment in our nation's history? The disability rights movement is organized around equal rights and human opportunity for all, regardless of what you look like, where you come from, who your parents are, or how much money you have. For all that our community can be kind of testy, and despite occasional strains in the disability coalition, more than most political efforts, the disability rights movement cuts across many of the usual lines of race, class, gender, nationality, even political party. It is premised on a real and actualized sense of shared humanity. You can see that in tangible results like curb cuts with high contrast strips and wheelchair accessible taxi cabs that have cochlear technology. Our focus is on building a future in which we all will benefit. So to me, the disability rights movement includes an awful lot about what's best about ourselves as human beings. These ideas are in short supply in the United States of our time. Perhaps beyond ourselves, perhaps we can offer some hope in the form of an example of what actual and functioning human solidarity looks like. And who knows where that could lead us. You know, the mass production of eyeglasses beginning centuries ago helped make mass literacy possible by increasing how many people could see well enough to read. In the same way, imagine what universal access and universal understanding could mean for all of us at the end of the disability revolution. Thank you.